Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining INDC tonight. My name is Connor Gallagher, chairman of the board here at Irish Network DC. I'd like to thank fellow board member and one of our original founders, the real backbone of Irish Network DC, Isabel Murray, for organizing and arranging this event. And I'd also like to thank our vice chair, Christine McCann, as well as Cleva Kenny, for their work in organizing, promoting, and facilitating this event tonight. Just a few housekeeping points before we get started. So everyone's aware we are recording this event. If there's any connection issues or if we're Zoom bombed, check your email for a new link. We don't envision this to happen, but in the unlikely event that it does, we should have a new link sent to your emails and be up and running again in a few minutes. Also, don't be shy. Please feel free to enter your questions throughout the event in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. I'd like to welcome our good friend from the Embassy of Ireland, the Cultural and Press Attaché, Ragnar Almquist, to say a few words about the Irish diaspora from the Embassy of Ireland's perspective, and then Isabel will get us started tonight on tonight's event. Ragnar, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Connor, and greetings, folks, and good evening, and to Turtle and Isabel, who are joining us all the way from Ireland. Soon to be good, well, already good night and soon to be good morning. But this very wonderful book by Turtle, which he's going to speak of this evening, The Irish Diaspora. The first line struck me: Ireland's first inhabitants were born in other lands. And it's always good for any book, whether a work of history or fiction or otherwise, to have a gripping first line. It resonated with me because my father was born in another land in Ireland and came to Ireland himself as an immigrant, as so many of our people in Ireland today are. And in his case, he came to Ireland to collect stories and folktales from storytellers along our western coast and the southwest in particular. And there's something about storytelling. My father is a folklorist, my mother a writer and novelist, which I think is quite intrinsic to great works of history and talented historians. And I think it's a quality which Turtle Bunbury possesses in spades, really. And it's a capacity to tell a story, to tell a personal narrative sort of succinctly, and to wear kind of great learning quite lightly. And it's a quality that really resonates right through this work, as it does through everything else of Turtle's that I've read. And I think which is one of the great qualities of a very fine writer, as well as a fine mind. I've had a chance just to read through the book over the last couple of days, picked it up at the weekend. It is extraordinarily easy read for something that's so deep and contains such wonderfully deep and rich histories. One of the things I was saying to Turtle, to my shame and ignominy as someone who's been working in the Department of Foreign Affairs for 13 years, and whose first job actually in Ivy House in Dublin was in a place called the Irish Abroad Unit, which was set up specifically to develop a policy for the diaspora. I'd never actually realized what the or bothered to look up the etymology of the word diaspora and where it comes from. And Turtle explains it in the second or third page as an aside, but derived from the Greek for the verb to disperse, to scatter. And I think it resonates actually very much as an Irishman abroad, and as all of members of Irish Network DC are Irish abroad or Irish Americans of Irish descent. That sense of a place having scattered and fragmented across the world. And it's one of the beautiful aspects of this book, that in 40 or so stories of incredible, exceptional Irish immigrants, it tells something of the personal history of that scattering and what it means to scatter. And so in scattering, we always come together again. And that's, I guess, one of the virtues of Irish Network DC and organizations like it, that it brings together the dispersed. And I said, it's something that's a pleasure for us to be associated with it as an embassy. So I'll hand over to our host, the redoubtable Isabel Murray, who's going to prompt Turtle, I think, as much as interview him with a few questions. And I hope you enjoyed the evening, and really highly recommend you pick up the book. I think it should be compulsory reading for any member of the Irish Foreign Service, and I think it's a great read for anyone else indeed.
Thanks very much, Ragnar. And I'd like to express our thanks to the Embassy, as well as to give a warm welcome to new guests joining us tonight through Politics and Prose and Irish Network USA, as well, of course, as our old friends and members of Irish Network DC. Our guest tonight, Turtle Bunbury, is here to talk about his most recent publication, which Ragnar showed you and I'll show you again, The Irish Diaspora, Tales of Exile, Emigration and Imperialism. It's published by Thames Hudson, and it's available through our partners tonight, independent bookstore Politics and Prose, based here on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, DC. Turtle is a very well-known and highly respected author, historian, and TV presenter. He's based in and joining us from Ireland tonight. His other books, which number many more than the 17 that we credited him with in our post for this event, but they include a wide range, such as The Irish Pub, Living in Sri Lanka, and Ireland's Forgotten Past, a history of the overlooked and disremembered. I strongly urge you to get your hands on this book. Turtle will have a podcast series available shortly, and he's also founder of the wonderful Vanishing Ireland series. His website is turtlehistory.com, and it's there in the chat. Thank you, Christine. Politics and Prose are offering a 10% discount if you buy tonight and use the code in that chat box. And we'll have signed book plates for purchases made this evening through that, using that code. Like a lot of other people, I had great plans about improving myself and reading widely during the unpleasantness of the last year. And also, like a lot of people, I found it hard always to be energetic and motivated on the self-improvement front. So it was a great treat to pick up this book, and I felt better about myself immediately. There are 42 chapters and it's extremely entertaining. I knew that we were a fairly personable crowd as diasporas go. And I thought I knew a good deal about the Irish in America, but I knew nothing about Nellie Cashman, Angel of the Wild West, or Louis Brennan, the Wizard of Oz. I didn't know that an Irish person, Dr. James Barry, performed one of the very first successful cesarean sections in the world in Cape Town in 1826. Dr. Barry was a very surprising person who went on all over the world to have an extraordinarily distinguished and important career as a medic. And I'll let you read more about that for yourselves in chapter 21. But without further ado, I'll turn this presentation and screen over to Turtle, who will bring us tonight's event in the form of a bespoke presentation rather than our usual question and answer. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end, so please do include your questions in the chat box. We'll post them to him at the end. But for the moment, you won't hear from me. Over to you now, Turtle. Welcome to Washington, DC, and we look forward to being able to welcome you in person soon.
Okay, thank you, Isabel, and greetings everybody from the tropics of County Carlow. It is a grand, soft, jet black night over here, springtime. I am delighted to be here, stroke there. Yeah, huge thanks to Isabel, to Christine, to Ragnar, to Connor for organizing and speaking those lovely, kind, very flattering, wonderful words. And to Politics and Prose as well for being on hand to distribute the book. We have about 40 minutes or so to cover about 1 million topics. So I am going to cut pretty straight to it. The subject of the talk, as you might have guessed, is the Irish diaspora, which is a term that could feasibly apply to about 80 million people today, apparently, which is about 1% of the planet. Can claim to be a little bit Irish. I'm not sure how many of those 80 million people are aware of that fact. Some people are very aware of that fact. The term diaspora, as Ragnar was saying, it also embraces the untold millions who've left Ireland in centuries past, and that's what the book is focusing on in this talk this evening. I'll be focusing on those who headed west from here across the Atlantic to the Americas. So I am going to share a screen now, and hopefully this will all go swimmingly smooth. And here we go. All right. Ireland is an island, of course, and it has been surrounded by sea ever since the North Atlantic Ocean was born 150, 200 million years ago, give or take a Sunday or two. For a lot of that time, we were under a very thick sheets of ice, but then the glaciers melted and we were free to roam. And I think it's always interesting when Ragnar was referring to the folklore earlier, but the folklore even in Ireland, in Irish legends, the Great Flood features. And I often think of that when the glaciers are melting. And it wasn't not so long ago that it was standard belief here in Ireland that one of the first settlers in Ireland was Noah's granddaughter, Cessair, as she was called, who apparently sailed into Bantry Bay or Ballinaskelligs with 50 maidens and 3 men. One of those men turned into a salmon and then an eagle, and eventually took up a career as a historian, which is an interesting thing to do. It's not the worst career in the world. Anyway, as I say, the only way on or off the island of Ireland until the 20th century was by sea. The jury is out as to when the first people arrived here. It's generally thought to be maybe 12, 13,000 years ago, but there was a documentary on RTE last week about a reindeer that got chopped up in a cave in County Cork 33,000 years ago that has us all completely confounded all over again. I think it's pushing it when people say that this, what you're looking at there on the screen, that this boat would have got you to America. But it is known in and around Rossaveel in County Galway as Columkill's boat. Columkill or Columba was amongst the very first Irish to head overseas. And he was, of course, went off to set up his monastery on the Scottish island of Iona, from which he then brought the word of the Christian faith into Scotland. Anyway, he didn't voyage on that particular boat because, yes, you guessed it, that is indeed a rock. So let me just get this here. However, what I do think that the ancients, the first people back in the way backs, Neolithic times, Mesolithic times, the guys who hunted for reindeer, I think that they sailed in the seas in these hollowed out boats like this one here. Did they cross the ocean? Could they have got all the way to America? Hard to know, but interestingly, Christopher Columbus, if we fast forward to 1477, and Christy Columbus apparently turned up in Galway. He was en route to the Faroe Islands and Iceland. He's said to have attended Mass in Galway in St. Nicholas's Church. Anyway, in his copy of Imago Mundi, one of his, a very important book at that time, he wrote, "Men of Cathay have come from the west. Of this we have seen many signs, and especially in Galway, in Ireland, a man and a woman of extraordinary appearance have come to land on 2 tree trunks." So, I mean, the most likely explanation is that they were Inuit who were swept eastwards by the North Atlantic. Some have said that the sighting of this duo, whoever they were on their raft, and the arrival of sort of non-native plants that were washing up into Galway Bay, that is what compelled Columbus to head west again in 1492. When he did sail, he was accompanied by a guy called Guillermo Iris, or I don't know how you pronounce his surname. People think it might be Harris, but he was himself a Galway man. So there was a Galway fella in Columbus's crew. Indeed, there were 3 Galway men are said to have been on Magellan's crew when he went on his first circumnavigation of the world in 1522. So I think the point is that Irish eyes are, well, certainly in the context of this story, they're looking west. And so that is the Rio de la Plata in present day Argentina. By 1540, you get the Spanish conquistador, Don Pedro de Mendoza. He goes on an expedition up there, and part of his force includes Juan and Thomas Farrell, who are almost certainly Irish. I mean, they were Irishmen. In the 1580s, you get another Irishman, Thomas Field, who's a Jesuit from Limerick. He's recorded as the first priest to say Mass in Latin America. He goes on a mission into Paraguay to evangelize the indigenous population there. So just in case you thought we were forgetting, sorry, that's a very blurry picture of St. Brendan's voyage, but we couldn't possibly tell this story without referring to the Brendan voyage. And Brendan having allegedly spent 7 years on the Atlantic visiting these strange faraway lands. When I started, when I first thought about it, I thought, well, this is all obviously complete make-believe. But then you delve into it, and there's actually a lot of, I don't know, fire where there's smoke. I mean, a lot of it adds up that he certainly, it's very convincing that he got as far as Iceland, possibly Greenland. Did Irish monks reach America in the 7th, 8th century? I mean, it's all possible, right? Hats off to the late Tim Severin, who passed away last year in 2020, I think. And in 1976, Tim handcrafted a replica of Brendan's currach, not the one he's holding there, obviously a much bigger one, with oak and ash, Irish oak and Irish ash, and traditional tools. And he sailed it 4,500 miles from Ireland to Newfoundland to show that it could be done. And, it could be done. Speaking of Newfoundland, I like to think that some of the Vikings who marauded Ireland in the 9th and 10th centuries were in Leif Erikson's crew when he reached North America and set up that short-lived settlement in Vinland. I can't remember where that was. Was it Newfoundland? Is it Canada? I'm not sure. Is anybody sure? The cod hunting fishermen of the Basque region, of course, they reputedly knew all about the American coast way, way back, but they were apparently clever enough not to tell anyone. So when you look at the Skelligs, for instance, nowadays that probably makes you think of Luke Skywalker because of that whole connection. That's a beautiful, beautiful picture by Madeleine Weber. I think we've got the Vikings, we've got the fishermen, we've got those early explorers, and we have Irish men and perhaps women heading off to the Americas. And you have the sensation that Ireland is no longer kind of the edge of the world where you're going to fall off, but there is still a tremendous mystery about what is beyond, what happens if you go west. What will you find? Well, you'll find profit if you're lucky, and that's sadly, with exploration comes exploitation. And by the early 16th century, Spain and Portugal have, of course, conquered and colonized large territories in South America, the New World, and putting the indigenous population into slavery to mine vast quantities of silver and gold. And you have these huge cargoes that are crossing the sea. And every summer, the Spanish treasure fleet sails from the Spanish Empire in Latin America back to Spain, and bringing with it all the silver and gold and gems and pearls and spices and tobacco and sugar and all the other stuff that they can get their hands on. And you'll see from that contemporary map that their course brings them quite close to the south coast of Ireland. And that's one of the reasons that Ireland, or the south coast of Cork and Waterford, starts becoming a bit of a haven for all those glorified pirates like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, or Raleigh, as he called himself. These are hardy guys, right? This is the days when an Atlantic crossing took between 6 and 14 weeks. It is not a voyage for the faint-hearted, but the Tudors weren't faint-hearted. And what we're moving into the 1580s now, which is when Queen Elizabeth's army subjugated, they defeated the Earl of Desmond, the Desmond Rebellion, and took over 500,000 acres of Munster in the southwest of Ireland. Ireland's relative proximity to the Americas at that time made it an attractive base for ambitious Tudors who were, going to the New World. And so a lot of them started, as I say, hanging out more and more on the Irish coast. And Cork Harbour continues to this day to be a popular spot to kick off transatlantic voyages. Very quickly, a few words about some of those Tudor explorers, like this man, Sir Walter Raleigh. By 1586, he gets 42,000 acres of Ireland, which I understand is about the same size as Washington, DC, just a little bit less. Washington, DC, apparently 43,000 acres. So he gets that amount along the Blackwater mainly. He becomes mayor of Youghal. His cousin, this guy here, Sir Richard Grenville, is sheriff of Cork, and has another couple of thousand acres that he wins after the Desmond Rebellion. And he's the guy who commands the fleet that brings all the settlers to establish that colony at Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. It's the lost colony, a failed settlement. He's eventually killed fighting the Spanish in the Azores. Another guy, Thomas Harriot, who's the most brilliant mathematician of his day. He's an astronomer, a physicist, another friend of Raleigh from Oxford days. He's got a house in Waterford, but he's going backwards and forwards to America. He spends one winter in 1584 surveying Chesapeake Bay, sleeping rough at night and getting to know the indigenous Iroquois and the Algonquin. He's actually the guy who brought back the first tobacco and the potatoes. As I say, he's got a place at Malana Abbey on the River Blackwater. Now, I know these guys are first generation Englishmen with basically holiday homes in Ireland, or sort of holiday homes. So yes, that does not tick the Irish diaspora box as such, but the idea that these Tudors were swanning back and forth between Ireland and the Americas, I think that is relevant. And I have no doubt that some of the crewmen on their ships were Irishmen from their Irish estates. Oh, sorry, that's one other, John White, that was painted by John White. He was the first governor of Roanoke. His granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Well, after Roanoke failed, he retired to Cork, where he died. So lots of connections there. The Tudor Age, it marks the start of a new era for England, especially after the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the naval balance of power shifting to England. I'm going to turn my sights in a moment on what would become the 13 colonies of North America. But before we say farewell to Latin America, I should say that the book also tells a number of stories about people in Latin America, like Don Gillen Lombardo de Guzman, who was born and bred William Lamport down in Wexford. And he ended up becoming the darling of the Spanish, the royal court in Spain, before going to Mexico, where he launched this bizarre and really strange and disastrous coup to try and seize control of Mexico. It failed, he was killed, and his unpredictable destiny was to give rise to the legend of Zorro. I'm sure many of you will have heard of this gentleman, Bernardo O'Higgins. So I talk about him and his father, Ambrose O'Higgins, the Viceroy of Peru, and how Bernardo teamed up with Don Juan McKenna from Monaghan to liberate Chile from Spanish dominance. We have Guillermo Brown from Foxford in County Mayo, who became the father of the Argentine Navy. And then that really remarkable story of Eliza Lynch, who became the first lady of Paraguay, a story that ended in a terrible tragedy for Paraguay in the late 1860s, 1870. There is also a massive Irish story to be told about the Caribbean. As the slave trade kicked into gear in the West Indies, Irish merchants were very much involved in victualling the slave trade. I will get back to slavery a little later in this talk. But as I say, first I'm going to tighten the focus a little bit on the birth of the USA. All right. In the census, the recent census, was it 2016, 2017? 3 million people, 3 million Irish Americans claimed to be Scots-Irish. I think that number should be way higher, but it's all got a bit hazy over the course of time. Statistics, you know, they're pretty hard to work with when you've got them from the 17th, 18th century, but they don't get simpler than this one I'm about to tell you here, whether it's very broad strokes. In the 17th century, so between 1605 and 1697, approximately 200,000 lowland Scots are said to have moved from Scotland west into Ireland, predominantly into Ulster, 200,000. In the 18th century, approximately 200,000, same number of what are now called Scots-Irish, are said to have left Ireland and gone to the Americas. Give or take many thousands, if you like. Those are ballpark figures, interesting ones. You know, the Scots-Irish, they were very much involved in, well, Teddy Roosevelt, he was a descendant of a Scots-Irish immigrant from Antrim. As he said, "My forefathers were the men who followed Cromwell and who shared in the defense of Derry and in the victories of Aughrim and the Boyne." And they were. But when during the course of the 18th century, there was a new pecking order, and at the top of that pecking order, it was the Protestants in the established Anglican Church. They're the top caste. The next caste is the Presbyterians, those more free-spirited minds, the Methodists, the Quakers, and other dissenters. You know, they're row two, lesser citizens. And then the poor Catholics are at the bottom of the pile with all those, you know, very few rights under the penal laws. So, sorry, there is Teddy Roosevelt, who also called his Scots-Irish ancestors a bold and hardy race. So they weren't going to put up with being second-rate citizens for very long, and that's when you get the 200,000 roughly Scots-Irish sailing to the 13 colonies. That journey is now, well, it's cut down to about less than 4 weeks if you're lucky and you catch the Gulf Stream at about this time. They head over, they pile into this new land where they can practice their religion with greater freedom. Many of them push on to the Appalachian frontiers of Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee, Georgia, the Carolinas, putting manners on the wilderness and fighting indigenous Americans. Their distaste for hierarchies is still apparent because there's still the Protestant elite are still kind of in charge of the 13 colonies. They've got a very definitive colonial hierarchy and ecclesiastical hierarchy, everything headed up by the British Crown. So, not surprisingly, when you come to the Declaration of Independence, well, 11 of those signatures on that declaration are either Scots-Irish or Irish-Irish. And by that, I mean people who are either born directly in Ireland or they're children of first-generation Irish immigrants and had that zest for independence. The man pictured there is John Dunlap, who printed the Declaration of Independence, and he too was an Irishman from Strabane in County Tyrone. And he clearly liked it in America so much that he called up his buddy James Wilson back in Strabane and said, "This is a great spot, you should come over here." And James Wilson did come, and James Wilson's grandson was Woodrow Wilson. So in fact, 16 US presidents have Scots-Irish ancestors. There's 21 presidents with Irish ancestry, but 16 of them have Scots-Irish ancestry, which is a pretty amazing haul, really. That is el presidente de los Estados Unidos. Very quickly, just to run through some of the 16. That's James Buchanan, top left, who's the son of a Scots-Irish immigrant from Donegal. Next to him, with that very fine entry into the Movember contest, very good facial fluff, is Chester Arthur, whose father was born in Cullybackey, and his father actually studied in Belfast before emigrating to Canada. Next along is Grover Cleveland, whose grandfather was Abner Neal, a merchant from Antrim. Top right, that's Andrew Johnson. His grandfather was from up near Larne. He gets a bit of a bad rap as president, so does Buchanan, pair of them. But Johnson did somehow manage to acquire Alaska from the Russians. Then you have Andrew Jackson, probably the best known of them all, really, who's the son of Presbyterian emigrants from Carrickfergus. And his connection is so close that his two older brothers were actually born in Carrickfergus. So he could have been born in Carrickfergus. How different would American history have been if Andrew Jackson was not eligible to stand to be president? You've got the Bushes there from County Down. I haven't chased up the link as to where. They didn't chase up the link as to where they're from, as far as I know. And then Richard Nixon, again, James Moore of Ballymoney would have been his ancestor from that time. And, you know, those Irish connections with the revolution, they are everywhere. The Continental Congress, Charles Thompson, the secretary, again, another Derry man. Oliver Pollock, the guy who bankrolls the Patriots, one of the big bankrollers, is from Strabane. He's also credited with inventing the dollar sign, that famous dollar sign. John Barry, one of the fathers, there's two fathers of the American Navy. They're very modern-minded. And John Barry was born in Wexford in 1745, and his most successful captain, Gustavus Cunningham from County Donegal. Okay. I tell the story of the revolution through the tailor Hercules Mulligan, whose name is just too good for anybody to resist. And Hercules Mulligan, he's in Hamilton. I'm sure if you've seen Hamilton, you'll know the name. He is the spy who saved Washington's life twice. He was born in somewhere in Ulster. I'm not quite sure. I thought it was Coleraine, but there's a jury's out about that. In 1740, when he's 6 years old, he sails with his family for New York. He grows up and he becomes a tailor. And his specialty is making or adjusting uniforms for British officers stationed in the city. They love his good humor. He's very charming, very witty, and he also has a fabulous drinks cabinet, and that's key to his tactics. Because even though he is, looking after all the British uniforms, he is also, strangely and quite madly, a major patriot. He's in the Sons of Liberty. You know, they are committed to, well, not quite overthrowing at this stage, but certainly substantially reducing the British Crown's role in the 13 colonies. He's great pals with Alexander Hamilton, the future founding father. He serves on every single committee that the Patriots found in New York, and he's the one guy who turns up at every single meeting. He is there when they topple George III's statue, as you can see there. He is, he's in all of these things, and yet madly, the British keep buying their uniforms from him. And a serious loyalist, like the mayor of New York, he pops in to be measured by Hercules. Hercules goes to his drinks cabinet and pours a very stiff drink for the mayor. The mayor drinks it, guzzles it, and then spills the beans on this plan to kill George Washington. And Hercules is able to get the word back, and that's one of the two times he saved Washington's life. He's not always out of a cloud of suspicion. He is put in prison as a suspect on one occasion, but he's released and he goes back to tailoring and working as an undercover spy again, and charming the British and gathering more information for the Continental Army. He is helped greatly by he's got a very innocent looking African-American slave who is called Cato. And Cato is the guy who actually has the hardest job. He's running around delivering these coded messages. An example, in 1777, the British come into Mulligan's tailors and they place a large order for light uniforms. And Hercules thinks, light uniforms, where's hot right now? And he correctly interprets that as a plan by the Redcoats to advance on Philadelphia, the Patriot stronghold. So Cato sent off to get that word off to them. The downside, of course, of being a double agent has always been that if you're being friendly with the enemy, then your own allies think that you're very suspicious. So he was a great figure of suspicion, certainly to his patriot neighbors in New York, until 1783. You're looking at a picture of Evacuation Day. George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and Alexander Hamilton, his chief of staff, are just coming into New York. The English have moved out. And Washington, the very next morning, the first thing he does with Hamilton is they go around to Mulligan's haberdashery and they enjoy breakfast with the man, with his family, with the entire Mulligan family. And Washington proclaims him a true friend of liberty. So that is why he is immortalized in Hamilton. Okay. The White House. You are, of course, most of you, I think, in Washington, D.C. at this moment. You will know fully that the White House was designed and constructed by Kilkenny-born architect James Hoban, and then burned down by Robert Ross from County Down. That was Kilkenny versus Down. It does sound like a GAA match. And there's another one that's not the only GAA match. I was thinking about this one because Antrim played Longford once. They played at New Orleans in 1815. And by that, we're back to Andrew Jackson again. But he, as we mentioned earlier, he was born in Antrim. Well, he was the American general taking on Ned Pakenham, who was the British general who was born in Longford. Antrim won so convincingly that particular day that Ned Pakenham's body was sent home for burial, pickled in brandy. Okay, so James Hoban is the guy the Kilkenny architect who who designed and built the White House, and then after it was destroyed, he rebuilt it. In the book, I do trace the chapter. There's a chapter about Hoban's life, his early years in Ireland, where he worked as an apprentice wheelwright for the Earl of Desert in County Kilkenny. He was based in the Earl's carriage house. That is Desert Court, the lovely house where the family lived. It was destroyed in the Irish War of Independence. And young Hoban's, his great skill at drawing and mechanical work while studying at the estate school, it caught the eye of his lordship, of the Earl, who decided to become his patron and transferred the boy to the celebrated drawing school of the Dublin Society, now the Royal Dublin Society. By 1785, Hoban was in Philadelphia, which was then the capital of the Federal Republic. And he found favor with a guy called Pierce Butler. And Pierce Butler was from County Carlow. He had been in the British Army, but he'd switched sides, and he was now a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. I'll come back to Butler in a moment. It was at Butler's suggestion that he moved to Charleston, that Hoban moves to Charleston. Initially, he built a theater and a lot of private residences there. He set up a drawing school in Charleston. And he also met with Washington, George Washington. And George Washington was at this stage planning the construction of a new federal city. Washington had appointed 3 commissioners to oversee this project, one of whom was this guy, Daniel Carroll. Daniel Carroll, a scion of the Eli O'Carroll family of County Offaly, Laois, that area. Actually, the commissioners rejected the original design plan, largely because it required the demolition of a house that Carroll himself was building at the time, so he scuppered that one. It then got put on to Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State, and he initiated a competition with a $500 prize for whoever could design a suitable presidential mansion, and B, a capital for the Senate and the House of Representatives. And people were pretty skeptical about the whole idea of Washington's proposed city, and so skeptical that when the competition was announced, very few reputable architects entered the contest. George Washington, he'd remembered Hoban, the Kilkenny man, and he suggested that he enter the contest. Hoban did, and he won the prize, and he won, it was a 300 guineas a year contract to supervise the project. And actually, as you may know, it later emerged that Jefferson himself had been one of the anonymous entrants into that contest. So it could have been interesting if Jefferson had built the White House, wouldn't it? So by the autumn of 1792, Hoban, that's Hoban, a waxwork of Hoban on the right there, he had a massive construction site in the marshlands that surrounded the proposed location of the mansion. And the White House would be his focus for the next 8 years. And, you know, when it was finished, it took a while, but it was pretty much a replication of Washington's vision. It found its feet under Jefferson, actually, who was a widower when he became the first president to properly occupy the mansion. And he lived there alone and very informally for the first 8-year term, during his 8-year term. I think of it, Hoban's wife, just in case you don't know this, you probably do if you're in DC, but his wife Susanna was the daughter of Clement Sewell, who was a hero of the Revolutionary War, and he's the guy who established the City Tavern in Georgetown. Hoban himself maintained his Catholic faith during this time, and he built a makeshift church for workers on the site of what is now St. Patrick's Church. He actually appointed a Dominican priest from Dublin as its pastor. He also supported other religious foundations in Georgetown, such as the Jesuit community there. He put his son in there, was a student and later a priest there. And the Monastery of the Visitation Order, which was founded by a lady from Kilkenny, Alice Lawler from Ballyragget. Hogan's workforce of 400 labourers undoubtedly included many Irish stoneworkers and carpenters and bricklayers and so forth. However, at least 200 of the men who worked on the project were enslaved persons, hired out from neighbouring farmers who received the wages in lieu of the slaves themselves. And indeed, at least there were 7 carpenters who worked on the White House, and at least 3 of them actually owned by Hoban and came with him from Charlestown. You get quite a good sense of it all from the opening scenes of that John Adams series, or there's an episode in it where they're building the White House. I was always very impressed by that scene. And I think, so we'll talk about slavery for a moment. I mean, the transatlantic slave trade, it is a scar upon all our pasts, as we have all been made very aware in the last year or two. Irish port cities such as Dublin and Cork and Waterford all enjoyed very buoyant export of food and provisions to the plantations of the West Indies and the American South. In the book, I have a chapter on a man called Richard Brew from Ennis in County Clare, who became the foremost slave trader on the Gold Coast in the 1750s, 1760s. And he traded from, you can see in the background of that picture there, a place called Anamabu in present-day Ghana. And many of the sugar, cotton, rice, and tobacco plantations in places like Georgia and the Carolinas, as well as the Caribbean, you know, they were owned or run by people from Ireland. And if you think of Gone with the Wind, which I've always loved as a film, but you know, you have to realize that it is based on the book by Margaret Mitchell, who's the great granddaughter of an Irish emigrant. But it, you know, the whole idea that it centers on a plantation called Tara, and you know, the families that it features have got names like O'Hara, Kennedy, Butler. I mentioned Pierce Butler earlier, James Hoban's patron, who was a founding father of the United States of sorts, certainly very much involved in all those events. He was also one of the biggest slave owners in American history. And he's also the principal promoter of the Fugitive State Clause from 1787, which was put into the Constitution, the US Constitution. And that's the one that ensured that enslaved people who fled from one state to another could be returned to the state from which they escaped if they were captured. That, you know, is a pretty horrific clause. It was not repealed, but it was mostly obliterated by the 13th Amendment in 1865. I have a picture there of Andrew Jackson, because he was an ardent supporter of slavery. He owned at least 161 enslaved people. And so was John Caldwell Calhoun, His vice president, look at that face on him, so really quite a face on John Caldwell Calhoun. His statue, that is his statue being taken down from Charleston last year, shortly after the city mayor described him as South Carolina's most consequential defender of slavery and white supremacy. And Calhoun, his father, was a Scots-Irish immigrant from Donegal. I mean, even saintly Margaret of New Orleans, who I wrote about in the book, and she's just, you know, she's as lovely as you get in that era. She's, you know, this baker from County Leitrim who sets up orphanages and is a, you know, truly benevolent lady. And then you look, and she bought at least 6 African slaves at the city market. You know, it's all very dark and complex, but I'm trying to find you know, upbeat aspects to it. I feel that we need to acknowledge, for instance, the work of the Marquis of Sligo from Westport in County Mayo, a descendant of the pirate queen Grace O'Malley, who oversaw the abolition of slavery in Jamaica during his tenure as the island's governor in the 1830s. Anyway, look, at that whole issue is something that we are exploring more and more in Ireland at this time, and I'm quite sure the story, you know, the research is going to reveal more and more as we advance forward. So we've talked of the Scots-Irish, the revolution and slavery, and I'm sorry to hit you with another fairly, you know, dark topic now, but the Great Hunger is something that we also need to do, as I'm also acutely aware of my timing here. I call it the Great Hunger, others call it the famine. Well, it is, whatever you call it, it is the genesis, the origin, the beginning for many millions of Irish Americans. You know, by 1845, Ireland's population is reckoned to be 8, maybe 9 million. And as you probably know, they're hugely dependent on the potato. Then the fungal blight comes along, probably from Mexico, and it causes the crop to fail. About a third of the crop fails in 1845, and then boom, 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 it keeps on happening over the ensuing years. You are left with, if these figures are still, you know, accurate, there's 1 million dead, 1 million emigrate. Ireland's population down by almost a quarter by 1851. These are pretty staggering percentages and statistics to ever get your head around. 500,000 people are said to have fled from Ireland in 1847 alone, primarily to the UK and Canada, and then on to the US. I've always been amazed by the Toronto, where as an indication of the knock-on effect, where 38,000 people arrived in Toronto and doubled the population over the course of that year. So I talk in the book, I talk about some of the characters who arrived in the US as children during this time and then grew up in the US. I talk of Billy the Kid's mum. That's a picture, apparently a picture of Billy the Kid playing cards down the bottom there. I talk about his mum who arrived over in 1847, of Mother Jones. That's her on the right, you know, very powerful symbol for feminists and the radical left today. And Billy Ford, father of Henry Ford. Again, all these guys. So many of them. I also talk about quite a lot of the Irish, you know, over somewhere in the region of 200,000 Irish-born participated in the American Civil War. A lot of they would have all been children, pretty much, during the famine. If they came over at that time, from, you know, they would have had maybe early memories of the famine, as Sebastian Barry so brilliantly depicted in his book. Most of them served for the Union, but at least 20,000 were in the Confederacy. I look at the story of the Civil War through a particularly interesting private called Albert Cashier, Little Al Cashier. After the Civil War came the railroads, and that whole story of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is an enormous achievement by, well, the Irish and the Chinese in the 1860s. And at least the statistics, for example, the Union Pacific had at least 3,000 Irish laying the track westwards from Omaha, Nebraska. we go on to Ellis Island. Okay, so between 1815 and the end of the First World War, 1920 roughly, 6 million people are said to have moved from Ireland to America, mostly Roman Catholic, mostly settling in the north and east of the United States, in New York and Boston, Philly, Chicago, San Francisco. By the end of the 19th century, it's actually only about 2.1% of the US are actually Irish born, but you throw on another 6.5% whose parents were born in Ireland. So it's a pretty big population. It's also confusing because many Irish would have said that they were from Britain at that time. So that's where statistics become hard to work out. But look, you know yourselves, if you're over there every time, you're constantly meeting people whose ancestors would have been coming over at this time. The US wanted to control it, or they made their first serious attempt to control immigration with the immigration station on Ellis Island in 1891. And on New Year's Day, 1892, 17-year-old Annie Moore from Cork City became the first person to be processed at Ellis Island. You kind of get the impression she was selected a little bit because the government, it was a big press event. They had all the major American newspapers were there to capture the event. The story is that Annie, that she sailed over with her brothers pictured with her there to join their parents who were already in New York. A 10-day voyage across the Atlantic in a steamship, and they arrive at Ellis Island. And the story is that a big burly German had one foot on the gangplank and was poised to make history as the first immigrant, when an Irishman grabbed him by the coat collars and hauled him back and said, "Hey, ladies first," and ushered Annie ahead of him and said, "Step out, little girl." I have a few other stories to tell, but I think at this point what I might do is I might leave it. I'm going to stop my sharing and leave it to go back to you there, Isabel.
Well, Turtle, we do have a very interesting question here, which I'm going to paraphrase for brevity's sake. And we have an attendee who's raised the interesting question of whether or not dispersal is a word that we associate largely with the Jewish community and their desire and pull towards home. And then she writes that, that's very relevant in the context of Irish Americans pull back to Ireland as our motherland. And I'd like to add on another bit to that, Turtle, which is that a great many Irish Americans who came to Ireland, to the United States, never went back. They were either never able to, or some of them never wanted to visit Ireland again. And I know in my own extended family, there were people who made out well in the United States and never wanted to go back to their much humbler origins. Could you speak to whether or not this can't be a uniquely Irish experience of dispersal, maybe in the context of, Jewish people, as that questioner put it? Do you have any insight there? Is there something a bit forlorn about being an emigrant rather than in difficult circumstances rather than by choice?
Well, I mean, that's it. I mean, it was, generally it was pretty horrific reasons for most people leaving. Obviously, of course, some people leave for adventure. You mentioned Nellie Cashman earlier. She was an adventurous spirit born under a wandering star. But, for many for so many people that, as I mentioned, the story begins with the Great Hunger. And that created, a deep bitterness that is still there in Irish America today. And it's, at its most extreme, it's accusations of, that it was a genocide. And I think that definitely was people turning their back on the homeland as well. There was also that bit that a lot of the people who came from Ireland were native Irish speakers. And when they got to America, they were told not to, to lose that language. It was a sort of no Irish need apply time, especially during, especially during the 19th century, but right through to the 20th century. We could maybe touch on that. But I think what's also becomes apparent really early on, and you can go back as far as Wolfe Tone for this one, but the whole notion of Irish independence, that the energy and the money that comes from Irish America is massive for a very long time. As I say, Wolfe Tone was knocking around Philadelphia in the 1790s. But by the time you get all those young Ireland leaders, for instance, from the 1840s, they all spend time in America afterwards. The whole Fenian Rising of 1867 is very much in cahoots with, I talk in the book about plenty of people who were living in America that went back to Ireland to fight in this event. Charles Stewart Parnell, he was coming over, getting a lot of money from Irish America during his time, and De Valera, of course, would later. And just to finish on that, the Easter Rising, I don't think it would have been possible without funds raised by Clan na Gael. That's where the money came from to buy the German guns that never actually got to Ireland, but that's where it came from. And you could bring it through to NORAID, what they were sponsoring Irish nationalism in the 1970s. Friends of Sinn Féin today, still getting big money from Irish America.
Well, and then I have my own question for you, Turtle, which was something I meant to discuss with you offline in our chat beforehand, because I didn't think it was a big question. But as you went through the list of people, they're very colourful and interesting and courageous characters. I think Hercules is my favourite. Do you have a favourite emigrant from Ireland to the United States? Is there somebody who really sticks in your mind as, an extraordinary character?
Well, I really did, because I wasn't sure I was going to do her, but Nellie Cashman is fabulous. She is would appear to be from Middleton in Cork, but she's just so gung-ho. She is galloping up and down the west coast from deep up in sort of places, British Columbia, I think, isn't it? Does she get up there all the way down to Arizona? She is hanging out with Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday one moment, and then, as I say, she's like way up in the frozen north at the end. And she was born in the famine, just at the time of the famine, and lived to fly in an airplane when she was, in the early 1920s. She is brilliant. In terms of wacky characters, I think Brendan Bracken is quite something. He was Winston Churchill's Minister for Information during the Second World War, the answer to Goebbels. Winston Churchill thought he was Australian, and I think a lot of people thought he was Australian because he'd said he was Australian, but he wasn't. He was from Tipperary. He was born in Tipperary, and his father was a leading Fenian and one of the founders of the GAA. And he just sort of reinvented himself. And
he seems to have gone to some trouble never to allow his colleagues in London to know that he was in fact Irish. Was
amazing, yeah.
Would it have been a great?
Sorry, you were going to say, would it have been a great?
Would it have been a much greater disadvantage to him in Britain of the time then? Would it be less of a disadvantage now, or would it have been no disadvantage at all in America? It's all very much where you find yourself, isn't it?
Well, to an extent, but he was only about 22 or 23 when he got offered a job by Winston Churchill. And I think at that stage he'd told the lie that he was Australian. And I think if Churchill had found out that his best buddy was the son of a guy who founded the GAA and was a member of the Fenian Brotherhood, he might have changed his tune on it. Or maybe Churchill really did know, but apparently he didn't know. I thought that was, that whole thing is very interesting. And obviously the Joe Biden's election made the book seem even more relevant. I mean, I've been doing my research on all the different ancestries of the Irish American presidents anyway. And so, that whole story of the Biden family, I actually think it's really interesting. The Blewitts who were running a workhouse in Ballina, and his forebear was actually, laying the roads and drainage works in County Mayo during the famine. I just thought that was very interesting. Although, after Hercules Mulligan and Bernardo O'Higgins, we have to make room for Ambrose Finnegan in the great hall of Irish great names. And that's was he the blind fiddler, or his father was the blind fiddler? And that's another of Joe Biden's ancestors.
Right. Well, with that, I'm going to thank Turtle for his fantastic lecture this evening. This was really fun, and I really do urge people to buy and read this book. Just take a chapter a day. You'll be amazed. The characters are so interesting, and you cannot but improve your knowledge of history because you're looking at their life stories in the context of what they were doing. And the circumstances that they came to the United States in. So I really actually improved both my knowledge of Irish and United States history through reading this book, Turtle, and I want to thank you for that. We look forward very much to welcoming you to Washington before too long, and I hope that we can take you in person to see some of the places you mentioned this evening. Of course, the White House, the Capitol, Visitation Convent in Georgetown, and Georgetown University. We know Washington well. For many of us, it is our second home, and for many of us, we love our second city. So we look very much forward very much to being able to welcome you to it and to put all these characters in context in it. So thank you, Turtle. Thanks also to your wife, Ali. Ali is Turtle's agent, and helped put this evening together. I'd like to thank also Kate Shawcross and her team at Politics and Prose, as well as, of course, Radmer Almquist and the Embassy in Washington, DC, and Harry Burton of Thames and Hudson Publishers. Our own board members, I'm sorry, I have to put my teeth back in, it's late here in Dublin, but our own board members, Conor Gallagher, who's chair, and Christine McCann, vice chair and Zoom administrator, as well as Kiva Kenny, who manages our communications, and all the other board members who work hard to keep us all together in these difficult times. So with that, I'll just give you a reminder to join us next month. Next month is Mental Health Awareness Month. And on May 19th, we will be hosting Irish mental health expert, Dr. Harry Barry, for a discussion of his latest book, which is called Emotional Healing: How to Put Yourself Back Together Again. In my case, I think I started with a chapter a day of Turtle's book, and you could do the same. So thank you for joining us tonight. Until next time, stay out of trouble, stay healthy, and stay connected. We look forward to seeing you in person soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll just say President Biden has promised to join us at the residence soon, and when we meet him again, the ambassador, I'm sure, will highlight that how fondly you referenced Ambrose Finnegan as a name. And I think when someone who's called Turtle Bunbury says you have a great name, you really know you have a great name. So, thank you again, Turtle.
Thanks, Ragnar. Well, listen, thank you all very much indeed. And yes, if you enjoy the book, give it a rating on Goodreads, will you? That's always apparently does wonders for us authors. But yeah, very much enjoyed the evening. So we'll see you in person one of these days.
Thank you. Thank you, Turtle.